Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give you something to improve your threat hunting program. And this week, what we're going to focus on is how threat hunting is a team sport and how you can build and lead the right team to threat hunt. So we're going to present the team structure we like. Obviously, what's going to work for you is going to vary, but we're going to give you kind of the pros and cons of the approach that we like for building threat hunting teams, and then how to scale them. So hopping right into it, a Phil Jackson quote, so the strength of the team is each individual and the strength of each member is the team. Just like basketball and just like a lot of other sports, threat hunting is actually a specialized role-driven field. And so as we'll see when we talk about specializations and building teams, the strength and who you put on the threat hunting team, the skills they have, the experience they have, really does matter for that end product that comes out the other end. And specifically where threat hunting does better when it's a team sport is things like right out of the box cognitive biases, right? So those are the psychological ways that our brains can kind of short circuit logic. And where the team helps is that the team can help reduce cognitive biases because other team members will say, hey, your thought pattern there might have gotten off a little off track. And so having multiple people can kind of fix the mental errors of one person. Beyond that too, you have different levels of skills and experience. This varies throughout the team. So whether you're just starting out and you just have a few people or you have a bunch of people, there's always going to be people that are on a different part of their journey from the skills and experience side. The other big one when it comes to threat hunting is the environment, technology, and evidence differences present challenge. So again, if you have a network analyst or you have a host analyst, going back to the skills things, and with this, you're going to need certain people on the team that are knowledgeable in network, that are knowledgeable in host, to make up for maybe the deficiencies or the knowledge gaps of other team members. And finally, as we were kind of said with the cognitive bias side, teams that can constructively challenge each other, they're going to get better and they're also going to think farther outside the box. So let's hop right into it. So you might ask, how do I build a successful threat hunting team? We're going to start at the lowest level and work upward. And what we like is actually the delivery team, or the pod structure as a lot of people call it. The ideal team size is like 2 to 5 people. I honestly like 3 to 5 people because at 3 people, it can help break ties to where if you put 2 people, they'll get in contention with each other. But 2 is so people can challenge each other. And once you get to the 5 or 6 point, you begin to bring a lot of bureaucracy into the team. So there's definitely that sweet spot of, what's the right size for the team to function without, while reducing as much interpersonal, problems as you can. And once you get to 6 people, like I said, sometimes the pods will get a little crowded. And 2 to 5 to me is the sweet spot there. So ideally on a team structure, you have a lead, right? And you might have a lead that's in charge of the pod itself for delegation purposes. So this might be the senior person that you hire in. You say, hey, you're going to be in charge of this pod. You're going to be in charge of the mentoring. We're going to pass down a program manager, a project manager might pass an engagement down to you, give it, and how your pod does the engagement is up to you as the team lead. So the team lead is hopefully that single point of contact that you have from the business level to actually interface with the threat hunting team itself. But the point here is someone has to be in charge. And so if you just set up pods and you say, okay, free for all, and anyone's the interface, you're going to find a lot of problems when you build this out because people are going to be approaching different people. There's different entrances and exits, and there's not going to be a whole ton of accountability, most likely, in the free-for-all approach. We recommend having a scribe also on the team, someone to take notes. A lot of times that's not the team lead because you want the team lead to focus on doing it. And having a scribe or someone to manage documentation and notes, this can be helpful when it's not the team lead. And then you have team members beyond that. Some of the advantages of the pod approach is it scales with your business needs. And we'll talk about this a little later on in today's talk. But you can actually grow individual pods, and then you can begin to add multiple pods as your threat hunting or as your engagement need grows. And you don't have to change how each pod functions. So again, these are kind of independent, fully functional units of work, if you will, that are working on the threat hunting engagement. And for you to scale, you just have to add more of them. The other big one, and this is where multiple people, right, where the team approach really turns out well, is personal growth is actually built into the organization, right? So we talked about varying levels of experience and skill. Having a senior person on the pod and then bringing in maybe 2 or 3 junior to mid-level people, you're going to have the senior that's mentoring the junior and mid people. And honestly, you could have junior and mid people that are better at a given specialization than that senior person. So you're going to have personal growth actually in both directions when you're implementing this. The other big thing with this is the redundancy part. And so both from the personal growth, but also from the business redundancy, the good thing with the pod approach is if you're tasking the pod with work and you're saying, hey, we're going to plan for the capacity of you, people can take time off, get sick, quit, and not delay or risk the project. Because again, if someone's out, then you would hope that other members of the pod would pick it up. To where if you weren't using a pod approach, if you were actually just delegating down or tasking down to a single point of contact, you'd have to bring in a new point of contact. You'd have to catch them up on the process. And, so there's going to be a lot more delay than if you go with kind of the pod unit structure and you plan redundancy that way. So huge operational benefit by actually going with the pod structure there. Another one, personal delivery speed and quantity varies over time. So people have good weeks and they have bad weeks. They have weeks they put out a lot and they have weeks they put out a little. And the good thing with the pod approach is, strength of the team, right? So if one member on the team is having a good week this week and another member on the team's having a so-so week, they're actually going to kind of average out on their output. And likewise, a few weeks later, if it flips and the person that was good a few weeks before is now so-so and the so-so person's good, you kind of build a better output average, hopefully, by doing this. And, you deal with that speed side. So again, if someone has to go out sick or, if for whatever reason, they're not available, the pod speed can help with that speed and with quality. It's not just about speed. The pods can hopefully self-regulate and challenge each other to deliver quality products. And so the good thing when we talk about quality control, internal to the pod, you can say, okay, well, here's some quality control gates you need to hit inside your pod. The other thing you can do is, okay, when your threat hunt report is almost done, we want you to give it to this other pod so this other pod can peer review it. And they don't have kind of that, they're not inside that team, so they don't have the emotional ties or as much into the project. They're going to be a fresh set of eyes reviewing it. So again, with pods, and especially when you get into multiple pods, you begin to get a lot more quality control options when you're building your threat hunting program. Finally, HR issues, they're going to happen as your organization grows. The good thing is you can change pod assignments if you absolutely have to cycle people out, or if you just want to cycle people out. So as team grows, sometimes people want to work with new people. So you might say, hey, every quarter, every year, every 6 months, you can rotate pods. What I will say, you probably don't want to do it every quarter because you're going to disrupt the natural flow that people have with each other. So if you are going to shift pods around and reassign, make sure it's not too short, because there is going to be time where people are going to be, forming, storming, norming, performing. There's going to be those team dynamics at play for every major switch you make. So you need to be mindful of those. The last interesting thing on this is when you're building this type of pod structure, you can actually consider putting a junior person in charge of an engagement. So they might not be in charge of the pod overall for an administrative tasking level, but you can say, hey, pod lead, for this engagement, I want to make sure that a junior is running this threat hunt or a mid person's running this threat hunt. Because what's good is, again, in this self-regulating pod structure, it creates a little bit of an environment to where people can fail, and it probably won't go out to a customer, right? You can catch the quality issues and quality control before they go out. And so you give an opportunity for people to grow, potentially with lower risk of you looking bad at the end to a customer. So we talked a little bit about specializations, and so the next question might be then, how do I deal with specializations, right? In InfoSec, we have a lot of areas that we're specialized across, whether it be host network disk, whether it be things like embedded or industrial, industry specifications, industrial defense, things like the environment, right? Does this threat hunt involve mobile? Are there a bunch of embedded systems I'm going to have to worry about? Is there a bunch of OSX? Am I going to need a reverse engineer skill set to actually perform this threat hunt? Data analysis, right? We hit that, network, memory, and disk. And also on some of these threat hunts, you might actually bring in less technical or less traditional roles. So you might bring in some of the actual operations people, even outside of IT, people like business analysts, like risks analysts, people that really understand the environment that you're running the threat hunt in, because those people often will have insights that the cybersecurity analysts might not have. And so going into power networks, we had that happen all the time. We talk to control room operators and say, okay, hey, if you were going to bring this network down, how are you going to bring down this energy system? And sometimes actually the control room operator has better scenarios than a tech person because they understand the business operation better. And so when you're doing your pod and when you're dealing with specializations, if you have a pod that's focused on a specific area like industrial, you might bring in control room operators to look at this. Certain pods might be more capable than other pods of performing certain tasks. As your threat hunt program grows and as the demand for your program grows, you might find you need to grow that specialization, but the fact is, you might have a pod that's better at industrial. You might have a pod that's better at dealing with Macs or mobile or other kind of niche platforms that you don't just see in a traditional Windows network. Most medium to large companies are going to need specialized skills for threat hunting because their operational complexities grow, right? They're doing business in more places. They have people traveling more. They have people farther outside of kind of the traditional IT boundary. And so specialization is one that's going to be really important to consider when you're growing your threat hunting program. Quality control, we've talked about this a little bit. So what about quality control, right? As we said, the good thing with pods is you have both internal and external quality control. So on the internal side, you would hope that internal team members have the camaraderie, have that closeness to actually be, using each other as a sounding board and challenging each other. Some teams, and especially if they're regulating, some people and some teams might be divide and conquer, and that's fine. But you still at some point want them to come together and be like, hey, this is what I'm thinking of doing. Hey, and, have the other person challenge that or say, yeah, no, that sounds like a great plan. So having that internal sounding board during the project and not just a gate, that quality control gate you send at the end, is going to deliver a far better quality. You also have that opportunity for mentoring, right? So we talked about having the lead that might be a principal or a more senior, and then having those mids and juniors, right? You want to see mentoring downward. You also want to see mentoring upward, right? So like we said with specializations, you might have juniors that are actually better at mids or seniors at a given task. And so there can actually be tech mentoring upwards as the juniors are actually teaching people higher up. And the other good thing with the internal quality control within the pods, like we said, are having that internal review of deliverables. This is often the first set of eyes, before it goes to another pod or before it goes to someone in the business unit for review. And having multiple set of eyes on your deliverable is going to generate a better project or product. Pod-to-pod quality control. So peer review of reporting is big here, right? So as your organization grows, you definitely want to have pods looking at other pods' works. I've found in a lot of organizations as you expand this out, and as I expanded this out in a few places I worked, people are always interested in what other people are on the team are doing, and especially technical people, and especially when you have cool engagements, right? They're like, oh, cool, that threat hunt sounded really cool. What'd you do? And, you want to make sure you set up that opportunity for people on pods to learn from other pods. Quality control is actually one way of kind of keeping people in sync and kind of filling that desire to know, hey, what are other people working on? How can I learn from them? And so this sets up a really good opportunity, not just for quality control, but to encourage peers to actually work together. So, but definitely pod to pod quality control. It's a gate you should do, before it goes out the door. It's kind of a second level of review, and you might even have a third level of review if you have something like a technical writer in your organization, or if a manager actually reviews product before it goes out, or an account rep. It's pod to pod quality control is, maybe a second level of review above the team doing it that can really make sure the product's great going out the door. Huge benefit here to multiple pods also is going to be, it's going to force your organization to standardize your deliverables, and make the process repeatable, right? So when you're scaling your threat hunt program, something you need to think of is, how do we make the product consistent going out the door? And you don't want to bring the bar down and say, okay, well, consistency, we're only going to do these things. Consistency should set that low bar that people then, achieve over. But what multiple pods is going to force you to do is going to be like, okay, well, what's the output? If we're doing an APT 29 or 34 threat hunt, what are kind of the standards we look for one of those APT-driven threat hunts, right? And the good thing with this is making the process repeatable. When you talk about scaling your program, this is what it's going to make it easier, or this is what's going to make scaling easier when you're actually scaling your threat hunt program, is that repeatability and that standardized level, base level of quality there. Delivery pods don't have to be just internal too. So ideally, engagement management might be delegated to a pod lead. And this is per engagement, right? So if you're doing a threat hunt on behalf of a client, you would want that pod lead that's in charge of the engagement to likely talk with that client. So clients is someone that, a delivery pod might work with. And, line at the bottom there, that relationship with that external client, likely will still be managed by an account rep, by someone else in the organization, but it's all right to have pods actually working with those external groups. If you're doing it internally, these are going to look like stakeholders inside of your own company, right? Are they facility managers that you're actually doing the threat hunt for? Are they the network owners? Are you working with people like MSPs, right? Maybe you're in an enterprise where certain parts of your network are actually managed by managed service providers, right? And so your delivery pod is actually going to interface with that MSP, or they might bring the MSP in for that threat hunt to actually work as part of the pods. You might have other key partners, you might have operational dependencies. If you're working with OEMs or other vendors, you might actually have them involved, and third-party support, as we mentioned. So what does a pod actually look like? So in this example, we're going to use kind of three personas. So we have a senior in orange, we have a junior in green, and we have some external resources in pink there. And so this pod is a basic three-person pod. You have, the orange team leads, who's also a network analyst, and then you have two juniors, one's a network, one's a host. That team leader, that pod is working with the facility manager, and that pod's reporting to the CISO. So let's pretend for this example that your threat hunt program, that the engagement leads actually report straight to the CISO. And the goal here is to consider an internal threat hunt focused on usage of APTX techniques against a facility critical to business operations, right? So they're working with the facility manager because they're saying, hey, we want to look for APTX, and they're reporting to the CISO, right? Because at a certain level, there's what the facility manager worries about, and there's the fact that you're going to have to work with that facility manager to carry it out. And ultimately, the product might also be going to the CISO to say, okay, well, at the CISO level, this is what I care about with business operations, right? Or, hey, I didn't think about, that technical risk that you just showed in this threat hunt, or that we saw, APTX compromise in this threat hunt. So both the facility manager and the CISO are going to be key to this threat hunt. But at the end of the day, like all of this pod structure we're talking about, this is all it looks like. And this is what one pod looks like. And what's nice with this is when you need to scale your threat hunting program out, you can actually scale this out to meet project demand just by creating multiple of those pods, right? And what you're doing is you're just adding additional pipelines that can work simultaneously into the other pods. I should also mention that a pod doesn't just have to work on one engagement at a time. It's actually common if you have 3 people, the pod might be working on, 2 or 3 threat hunts at a given time, right? And they're load balancing within the pod. You want to make sure that you don't overwhelm them with work. But at this point, right, if each pod was capable of working on 2 or 3 engagements at a time, let's say 2, if you have 3 pods working 2 engagements at a time, you can now do 6 engagements at a time here. The pink we added on top was a threat hunt program manager, right? So this is just right when you start to add more middle management to say, okay, this program manager is going to do things like scheduling. They're going to do things like working with the sales team who's actually bringing in and closing the deals. They're going to be, working through kind of the higher program level stuff while the pods below are actually executing the hunts themselves. Important role, but this model actually works quite well for scaling things out. When we talked about specialization, the pod structure can also be scaled to meet that specialization, whether the specialization be market demand in a geographic area. So here we have 3 pods focused on the US, we have a Canadian pod and a New Zealand pod. If we picked up a lot of work in Canada, we might give that first pod and say, okay, you're also working in Canada. And you might ask, well, Dan, why would I geographically tie a pod, right? Some of this can come down to logistics, right? Do you have the passports and visas? Are you ready to go? Are you familiar going to Canada? If you're going to countries to where the cultural norms are different, you want to make sure you have people that are, comfortable working across cultural boundaries, that know how clients in that region work. This could also be vertical. So we could easily say, okay, well, 1 or 2 of these pods are good at industrial, and we just got slammed with a lot of, energy system threat hunts, right? You might add a 3rd pod to add that redundancy there. Likewise with types of data, right? If the pods are really good at network data and you start getting hosts, you might think like, okay, I'm going to scale the capacity of my ability to do these threat hunts by adding another pod capable of really diving deep into host data. So, you can scale not just on the geographical and on the logistics side, but also on the knowledge and, that specialization side. Finally, what I really like about the pod structure and something to point out is that pods can help you build a really healthy culture that'll help people thrive and help people really go to the next level. So, there's a lot of different articles on what are characteristics and what characteristics help build successful teams. From Harvard Business Review, we found this article, The Secrets of Great Teamwork. And I really like the 4 things they went with. So for today's talk, we're going to talk about those. And, when you talk about building healthy culture, at least in the opinions of these authors, there was really 4 things there, right? So there's that compelling direction. You can give these pods, what's nice with the pod structure is you can give them that compelling direction to say, okay, hey, this is the engagement and, this is why it matters, and go out and do great things, right? You can give them that strong structure, right? That normalization. Some of this and like skills and diversity with multiple people and with people learning from each other, you're going to actually build strong skills. You're also going to build strong diversity in the team in many ways. When we talk about norms, people need structure to function well. You also want to give them the leverage to act on their own, right? They need some creative freedom to run in. And so the pod structure also gets them, enough structure to where they know what they need to do and they know what the expectations are, while also giving them the ability to run. Supporting context, it gives them the right safety net, right? If you were to do this individually, it might build a lone wolf culture, when you get into lone wolf cultures, that's a completely different thing to manage, and it doesn't always build the most healthy culture. To where if you build pods that really work well, both internal and with each other, you're going to begin to build really that supporting context to where people feel safe with each other, and they're also, they have the safety nets for when they are having bad weeks. Shared mindset, right? Same deal, kind of as above. So pods give the autonomy for personality types that thrive despite differences, right? So you might see a pod that's made up of more introverts, which are more prone maybe to divide and conquer. Those people might take the engagement and go off and say, okay, we're going to work on our own and eventually we'll come back and do it. You might have pods that do that, to where you might have pods right next to them, which are extroverts and are more like, hey, let's hop on Zoom calls, work through this problem. Let's do this a little more collaboratively. And what's nice with this, when you talk about culture and when you talk about making people thrive, is that pods do give some autonomy within your organization for teams to run, based a little more on the personality of their teams, while still having that expectation, while still having those quality standards in place. And so, it tries to build kind of that perfect storm of productivity. So thanks for joining in this week. Again, this week we talked about how to build great threat hunting programs. We talked about the pod structure. We talked about things like quality control, how to make the teams up, and just considerations when you're building and scaling your threat hunting team. So thanks for joining in this week. We hope to see you back next week.